Welcome to Wichita Liberty TV with Bob Weeks.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita and Kansas government and politics. We're broadcast on KGPT, channel 26.1, and its companion website, kgpt26.com. Some of you may know me for my blog, The Voice for Liberty. It's at wichitaliberty.org, where the motto is individual liberty, limited government, and free markets in Wichita and Kansas. So I cover things that may not be covered by the Wichita Eagle or other television stations or radio, or if we do cover the same news, I'll do it from the perspective of economic freedom, limited government, and individual liberty, because these are the things that are really important to us, and these are the things that are so often under attack by our governments, be it federal, state, and local. So please visit wichitaliberty.org. You can subscribe to the email newsletter I send 2 or 3 times a week. And if you'd like to contact me, you can find my email address and telephone number there, or just remember bob.weeks@gmail.com. Well, if you've been reading the newspaper or watching the news, you're aware that Wichita city leaders are thinking about a sales tax increase because there's a long list of projects that the city wants. We need water and sewer pipes needing repair of over $2 billion. People want a new downtown library. People want an expanded bus transit system, maybe a new convention center, and then money for economic development. Now, some of these things are necessary. We need functioning water and sewer systems. It doesn't necessarily follow that government has to provide these services, but that's what we have in Wichita. We ought to ask, however, how our leaders let the system fall into such disrepair. Earlier this year, Wichita Mayor Coral Brewer said we need to spend $2.1 billion, that's billion with the B, $1 billion on water and sewer repairs over the next 30 years. That's spending at the rate of $70 million per year, which I think is about the amount that 1 cent per dollar of additional sales tax would raise. Some of these other things, however, we ought to think twice about before we let government provide them for us. So what am I talking about here? Well, is a library a good thing to have? Well, of course it is. But it doesn't follow that the library has to be a government-provided library. Recently, on his television program, John Stossel showed an example of a library in California that is privately run. The patrons of the library were not really aware that it was run by a private company, except they really liked the library. As an example, there's a vending machine where you can check out a fully charged laptop computer to use in the library. Can you imagine something like that coming from the Wichita Public Library? You may remember just recently that our library had to be closed for several days so that an infestation of bed bugs could be dealt with. And then our bus transit system in Wichita is in bad shape, financially speaking. And that system, of course, is owned and operated by government. But that hasn't always been the case, that government-owned transit systems. Here's Randall O'Toole of the Cato Institute writing 3 years ago. He wrote, "America's experiment with government ownership of urban transit systems has proven to be a disaster. Since Congress began giving states and cities incentives to take over private transit systems in 1964, worker productivity, that is, the number of transit riders carried per worker, has declined by more than 50%. The amount of energy required to carry one bus rider 1 mile has increased by more than 75%. The inflation-adjusted cost per transit trip has nearly tripled, even as fares per trip slightly decline. And despite hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies, the number of transit trips per urban resident declined from more than 60 trips per year in 1964 to 45 in 2008. You might be surprised to learn that the cost per passenger mile of operating the bus system in Wichita is 95 cents. Now, that's not the cost to drive a bus 1 mile. That's the cost to drive one passenger 1 mile. And only a small fraction of that cost is paid through the fare box, that is, by people who actually use the system. Taxpayers have to pay for the rest. But it doesn't have to be that way. A bus transit system could be provided by the private sector, and there's every reason to believe that it would be better than what government provides. And there are other things we could do to help improve transit system in Wichita. Referring to John Stossel again on his television show, recently he had a segment on a system called Lyft. That's Lyft. Now, this is a system available in about a dozen large cities in America whereby you sign up to be a Lyft driver. And you go through a background check, and if you pass, then you're a driver for Lyft. And then what people, the customers who need a ride somewhere, they use their smartphone to request a trip. And you as a Lyft driver can decide if you'd like to provide the ride. And if you do, after you drop off the rider, that is, the customer, decides how much to pay the driver for the ride. The system makes a suggestion, but other than that, it's up for the customer to decide how much to pay for the service he received. Now, as you might imagine, the system uses feedback to rate both drivers and customers. People in the Lyft system have an incentive to be good providers of service and also good consumers of service. Isn't that a tremendous contrast to the way government works? Government works through force, through taxation, requiring all of us to pay to support a bus system that very few people use. And few people use the system because, like many government programs, the service that is provided is lousy. It's a self-perpetuating feedback loop. Lousy government service leads to the need for more subsidy. But in the Lyft system, however, people willingly cooperate, aided by technology. Furthermore, government carves out monopolies for itself and for its favorite cronies. The Lyft system that I just talked about. I'm pretty sure that would be illegal in Wichita. That's because the city recently passed taxicab regulations that are quite strict. You must have a dispatcher on duty, a fleet of at least 10 cabs, things like that. This regulation stifles innovation and entrepreneurship. These regulations ensure that our present level of crappy bus and taxi service is all that we will ever have. Well, here's another example of the difference between the private and the public sectors. In the Lyft system, passengers ride in the front of the car next to the driver. Total strangers do that. Can you imagine if you asked to sit in the front seat of a taxi cab in Wichita? This is the private sector versus government-regulated monopolies. Now, recently, the new director of the Wichita Transit System made a presentation to Wichita City Council members outlining various possibilities about what Wichita could do with its bus service. Now, you may be wondering, was allowing the private sector a role in providing transit a possibility? Not that I heard, not that I read. It's just not in the DNA of government bureaucrats and, unfortunately, many elected officials to consider letting the private sector do a job.
You're watching Wichita Liberty TV.
Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. Well, another thing that a tax increase in Wichita might be used for is economic development. That is, paying subsidies to companies so that they will provide jobs in Wichita. Well, it's felt by many that Wichita needs to step up its economic development efforts because things haven't been going well lately. Not that everyone agrees. You've seen the charts I've shown you, showing the growth in jobs in Wichita and other economic indicators. When we compare Wichita with the nation as a whole and with what we call our visionary peer cities, Wichita is almost always in last place. Now, when I presented this data to the Wichita City Council members did not believe these numbers. So here's a chart that was presented recently at a Wichita Metro Chamber of Commerce meeting. It uses the same data source that I use. That's the Bureau of Economic Analysis, part of the United States Chamber of Commerce. And it shows the same data using the same methodology. And it comes to the same conclusion. Wichita performs poorly, usually in last place. Now, our Chamber of Commerce and its leadership will probably use this poor performance to argue that Wichita needs to spend more money on economic development, and that's a problem. You see, very often, your local Chamber of Commerce, they support principles of crony capitalism instead of pro-growth policies that allow free enterprise and genuine capitalism to flourish. Now you may be confused. Most people probably think that local chambers of commerce, since their membership is mostly business firms, that they support pro-growth policies that embrace limited government and free markets. But that's not always the case. Here, in an excerpt from his Wall Street Journal article titled Tax Chambers, Stephen Moore explains. He wrote, The Chamber of Commerce, long a supporter of limited government and low taxes, was part of the coalition backing the Reagan Revolution in the 1980s. On the national level, the organization still follows a pro-growth agenda. But thanks to an astonishing political transformation, many chambers of commerce on the state and local level have been abandoning their goals. They're becoming, in effect, lobbyists for big government. In as many as half the states, he continues, state taxpayer organizations, free market think tanks, and small business leaders now complain bitterly that on a wide range of issues, chambers of commerce deploy their financial resources and lobbying clout to expand the taxing, spending, and regulatory authorities of government. This behavior, they note, erodes the very pro-growth climate necessary for business, at least those not connected at the hip with government, to prosper. Journalist Tim Carney agrees. All too often, he notes, state and local chambers have become corrupted by the lure of big-dollar corporate welfare schemes. Well, this is the argument that the Wichita Chamber of Commerce and the Wichita City Council will be making. We don't spend enough on business welfare, they'll say, although they won't use that term. Capitalism and free markets, these things don't work. They're going to tell us that. Only government can save Wichita from decline. Business leaders will tell us that we need more taxes for more spending on economic development. But be careful here. There's a difference between business leaders and capitalists. Last year, Charles Koch explained the difference in an article in the Wall Street Journal. He wrote, Far too many businesses have been all too eager to lobby for maintaining and increasing subsidies and mandates paid by taxpayers and consumers. This growing partnership between business and government is a destructive force, undermining not just our economy and our political system, but the very foundations of our culture. And he continued, the effects on government are equally distorting and corrupting. Instead of protecting our liberty and property, government officials are determining where to send resources based on the political influence of their cronies. In the process, government gains even more power, and the ranks of bureaucrats continue to swell. Now, in his article, Charles Koch makes an important observation when he defines cronyism. He says, we have a term for this kind of collusion between business and government. It used to be known as rent-seeking. Now we call it cronyism. Rampant cronyism threatens the economic foundations that have made this the most prosperous country in the world. You regular viewers know that we have a problem with cronyism in Wichita. This is exemplified by incidents like where a mayor votes to send millions of taxpayer dollars to a man who owns movie theaters, and then the mayor sells his barbecue sauce in those very movie theaters. It's when a real estate developer lists the mayor and city manager as business references when bidding for a city project and thinks that no one will care or notice. It's when a city council member receives thousands in campaign contributions from an out-of-state construction company right at the time he votes to award a contract to that company. And it's when the city council votes to give overpriced, no-bid construction contracts to their significant campaign contributors. In other words, instead of allowing people to direct resources to where they believe they will be most useful, our local government directs resources to their cronies, where it's most useful for their political careers. Now, I'm of the opinion that this has harmed Wichita's economic growth, contributing to one of the reasons why Wichita is the bottom line in the charts we've seen. But many of our business leaders and almost all of our political leaders propose more of the same. Yeah, that's right. Instead of focusing on things like water and sewer pipes, government wants to raise taxes so that it can direct more of our economy for us. Having neglected our water and sewer infrastructure to the point where the mayor says we need to spend at the rate of $70 million per year for the next 30 years, our city leaders are going to ask us for more tax money so that they can try to fix the Wichita economy. Well, returning to Stephen Moore's article in the Wall Street Journal, he quotes John Caldera of the Independence Institute in Colorado. He says, I used to think that public employee unions like the National Education Association were the main enemy in the struggle for limited government, competition, and private sector solutions. I was wrong. Our biggest adversary is the special interest business cartel that labels itself the business community, and its political machine run by chambers and other industry associations. So let's ask our business and political leaders a few questions. First, will we acknowledge Wichita's poor economic performance, or will we continue to ignore the facts and statistics? Second, will we realize that the cozy relationship between City Hall and a small group of insiders, Wichita's cronies, if you will, is harmful and corrosive? And then third, will we realize that free enterprise and capitalism work better than cronyism? Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. Well, last month, David Hart, who is director of the Online Library of Liberty project at the Liberty Fund, spoke in Wichita on the topic, Bastiat's Lesson for the 21st Century, the Broken Window Fallacy Revisited Again and Again. And that's something, of course, that we've been talking about quite a bit on Wichita Liberty TV. Let's watch a little bit of David Hart's presentation earlier in Wichita.
The title for today's talk is Frederic Bastiat's Lessons for the 21st Century, the Broken Window Fallacy Revisited Again and Again and Again. Because what's striking is that so many of the arguments that we hear today about the benefits of government regulation and control and subsidies of industry were exactly the same arguments that Bastiat confronted in the 1840s in France. And his refutation of those claims, I think, still resonates strongly with us today. And that's why I think he's still worth reading, apart from the fact that he's incredibly witty and clever and worth reading for that sake alone. So here we have a picture, a cartoon from the Bastiat Institute, which I think is particularly clever because Bastiat's, one of his most famous sophisms was the story about the broken window and how the destruction of property, whether it's caused by natural disasters or by hooligan sons who throw rocks through windows, as in the story, does not lead to productivity or to prosperity, that there is enormous damage that's caused which stays with us. And that people who try to justify this by saying, well, let's look at the silver lining. Everything has a silver lining. And in this case, think of the wonderful stimulation that's going to cause to the glazier industry. And Bastiat thought this was an absurd argument and wanted to refute it. And we hear it again and again today. And what's interesting is that this week we've had the first anniversary of the tropical storm Sandy catastrophe in New Jersey. And that, in many ways, repeats many of the arguments that Bastiat was grappling with and refuting back in 1848. You'll notice, if you look very carefully, you'll see that on the table here is a copy of his economic sophisms. Right, so Bastiat, I think, must have got to the point where he was frustrated that everywhere he went, he would keep hearing the same story over and over again. The Keynesians, or in his day, the interventionists, kept throwing rocks through his window and saying, well, this has a silver lining, so don't complain about it. I've got a couple of examples of American economists and economic journalists who argue that these disasters actually have a silver lining, and we should appreciate that. And my bête noire is Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, author, very influential author for the New York Times, and Peter Morisi, who he's an economist at the University of Maryland. And let me just read you some of their statements to see what Bastiat and his modern modern versions are up against. This is Paul Krugman writing 3 days after the September 11 catastrophe in the New York Times. He says, the terror attack, like the original day of infamy, which is a reference to the Pearl Harbor attack of 1941, which brought an end to the Great Depression, which it didn't, but that's just the first fallacy, could even do some economic good. Right? So there's some goodness in destruction. Now all of a sudden we need some new office buildings. Yes, I suppose we do. As I've already indicated, the destruction isn't big compared with the economy, but rebuilding will generate at least some increase in business spending. Second, the attack opens the door to some sensible recession-fighting measures. Okay, so this is the excuse the government needs to step in and introduce all sorts of regulations and controls and interventions in order to do what must be done, which private industry, private investment refuses to do. Now it seems that we will indeed get a quick burst of public spending. Okay, so that's September 14th, 2011. This is more recently in 2001. This is more recently in 2011 in August, where he's interviewed on a CNN program. And he's sort of speculating, what do we need to do to get out of the current economic downturn? And he says, if we discovered that, space aliens were planning to attack, and we needed a massive build-up to counter the space alien threat, and really inflation and budget deficits took a secondary place to that, this slump would be over in 18 months, he declared, arguing in favour of the president's stimulus package. Right? So we need something to galvanise people's attention, make them work, and dedicate themselves to a project which is set by the government, which will be controlled by the government, funded by the government. Then we will get over the recession. He says, and then if we discovered, whoops, we made a mistake, there aren't any aliens after all, we'd be better off. Right? This is the Keynesian speaking. And he's not the only one. This is Peter Marisi, writing in Yahoo Finance. He says, the upside. So this is in response to Hurricane Sandy. Disasters can give the alien construction sector a boost and unleash smart reinvestment. Right? Previous investment was not smart, obviously. That actually improves stricken areas and the lives of those that survive intact. Ultimately, Americans, as they always seem to do, will emerge stronger in the wake of disaster and rebuild better, making a brighter future in the face of tragedy. When government authorities facilitate rebuilding quickly and effectively, as we know governments always do, the process of economic renewal in many tangible ways can leave communities better off than before. And then he has the whole paragraph about the multiplier effect, that for every dollar the government spends, this will stimulate more than $1 worth of additional activity which will benefit the community.
Well, after this, Dr. Hart went on to explain some of the things that we already know from our study of the book Economics in One Lesson, that there is no blessing to destruction. There is no silver lining. When the young boy threw a rock through the tailor shop window, well, instead of the tailor having a window and a new iPad, he has only a window. What he would have spent on the iPad is instead spent fixing something he already had and something he was already happy with. Now, everyone can see the new window, but it's difficult to see the iPad that wasn't purchased. It may even be impossible to see it. But we need to learn these lessons and apply it to every situation. Remember what Henry Hazlitt wrote for us, explaining the problem with understanding economics. He wrote, "This is the persistent tendency of men to see only the immediate effects of a given policy or its effects only on a special group, and to neglect to inquire what the long-term effects of that policy will be not only on that special group, but on all groups. It is the fallacy of overlooking secondary consequences." And later on in the book he concluded, and this is our lesson in its most generalized form. For many things that seem to be true when we concentrate on a single economic group are seen to be illusions when the interests of everyone, as consumer no less than producer, are considered. To see the problem as a whole and not in fragments, that is the goal of economic science. Well, thanks for watching this episode of Wichita Liberty TV. I hope to see you again next week and on the internet at wichitaliberty.org.